Good evening, everybody. I'm Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to our weekly virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. Whether you're watching on Crowdcast or Facebook Live, we are glad that you could join us this evening. And to those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training and facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics. So now that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have won the election, we wanted to take some time to look at that election through a gender lens and discuss how women voted, how female candidates fared down ballot, and then also look ahead to the new women who will be coming to Washington, including our Vice President-elect and our new First Lady, and of course, our own very first second man. We are super excited to have with us to share their reporting and analysis two journalists from the 19th News, which is a nonprofit and nonpartisan newsroom dedicated to reporting at the intersection of gender, policy, and politics. So that's right up our alley here. First, the founder and CEO, Emily Ramshaw, who I first knew from her previous post as editor-in-chief of the fabulous Texas Tribune, and their Washington correspondent, Amanda Becker, who has had a long career covering politics for Reuters and CQ. So thank you both for being here during what I know is a very busy week. I want to let everybody know before we start that we're going to save some time for questions. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see an ask the question prompt. So feel free to type in a question, or you can also upvote other people's questions that you may be interested in. And if you miss any of the discussion or you want to share this with friends, there'll be a full replay available at the very same link that you used to register. So welcome, Emily and Amanda. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us. It's so fun to do this with you.
Well, I want to start, Emily, with first by giving folks that might not be too familiar with the 19th, because it's new, tell us a bit more about your mission and how and why you founded it and launched it just a few months ago in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, I know. Talk to us about how smart it was to launch a startup in a global pandemic. That's a conversation for another day. But yeah, the 19th is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. So what that means is we are producing journalism around the clock that aims to elevate the voices specifically of women of color, women off the coast, and other people marginalized based on their gender in our society. So you'll see a lot of reporting from us. Obviously, this election has been front and center for us. Also, the pandemic that has, disproportionately affected women in virtually every arena other than mortality rates. So yeah, follow us at 19thnews.org. You'll see the extraordinary reporting of my colleague Amanda Becker here and others. We are brand new, but we're having just an extraordinarily awesome time getting this venture off the ground.
Well, you guys have so much incredible coverage on, the election and things going on. It's a great resource for folks. So congratulations on all that you've done so far. It's incredible. Let me ask Amanda to start with us on women voters. And we were talking a little bit earlier about these exit polls that are just not really cooked yet. And I think for journalists like Amanda, people in academics who kind of thrive on, information, who voted, why they voted, it's difficult because we're getting some conflicting information in and we don't know things exactly. So with that, preface there, Amanda, tell us what we do know or what we think we know about women in the 2020 election. Certainly, there was a lot of discussion before the election about women deciding the 2020 election. Do we think that ended up being true? And what other things are you seeing out there?
Yeah, so with that preface, because these exit polls have even been changing this week. So twice a day I go and look at these and I see how much they've changed from the last time I looked at them. What they show right now is that honestly, there hasn't been any massive change since 2016 in the women's electorate. There might end up being a couple of points shift one way or another. Obviously, Biden was elected this time and Clinton was not in 2016. But I think a lot of that movement is going to be on the margins when all of this is said and done, or at least that's what it's looking like right now. In most areas of the country that are swing states, this was still a pretty close election. and women followed suit. So right now, the exit poll that I checked literally right before this event started showed that 57% of women voted for Biden and 42% of women voted for Trump. That would, of course, be about a 15-point favorability that Biden had over Trump with women,
which is slightly higher than Hillary, I guess.
Slightly.
Right? Mm-hmm.
Well, it's slightly higher if you compare to her exit
polls, right?
But once you got what we call validated voter data, which is where they literally take these polls and then compare them to registered voter rolls and call them and verify. Trump has liked to say that he won white women by 52% in 2016. Once we got that validated voter data, what he was saying was based on exit polls.
Right.
Validated voter data showed about 47% of white women voted for him in 2016. So I would expect there to be a few point shift like that again, but really Biden won women, it's looking like, by about as much as Clinton did in 2016.
Emily, do you see a little bit of, just given those numbers and leading up to the election, we certainly saw so many women seem to be involved in this election campaign, participating at very high levels, turning out, really being kind of standing up and speaking out. What do you see as sort of like the big picture after this election in terms of women voters?
I mean, I think the overarching sentiment to me is that there's about half of the women's electorate that we do not know nearly as well as we need to know them. And I mean, I think the numbers that Amanda was just suggesting, these takeaways are that, white women in particular were largely unchanged is what it looks like, even though there were all of these predictions that there would be this sort of, seismic or at least sizable growing gender gap.
Right.
And yet again, we have an election where the Democrats are very reliant on, Black women in particular, to get them across the finish line. So I think, how deep these divisions remain among the women's electorate to me is like, an enormous story for us coming out of this election.
So Amanda, when you were reporting previous to the election, Emily just mentioned Black women who I think in some, big urban areas, and certainly as we kind of dissect what's happening in Georgia right now, really the influence that they have had on this election. What did you learn through the process about Black women and their participation in this campaign?
So just to give you an idea, and again, the polls could end up shifting a little bit.
Right.
We're talking about 57% of women overall voted for Biden, but 90% of Black women. So this is a significant difference between how Black women are voting as compared to white women or even just women overall. I think that you saw Black and Latino women power victories for Democrats or make the race competitive in places like Georgia and Arizona, which have never been swing states before. I think a lot of that work was done by Black women in Georgia and Latino women in Arizona. You had Stacey Abrams, who registered. I think it ended up being 400,000 new voters heading into this election. So you really saw Democrats do better than expected in places where they haven't historically, based on the power of that those women were bringing to those races. I think it was something special that Joe Biden was doing, or his campaign. I think it was the women of color on the ground in those states where there are changing demographics happening that really, did the hard work for the past 2, 4, 6 or more years to turn those states into battlegrounds.
And as we look now toward the 2 special elections in Georgia, I assume that will sort of only continue when you're talking about Stacey Abrams and turnout in Georgia, right?
Yeah, and so even between now and those special elections on January 5th, it's estimated that I think it's about 20,000 more voters will come of age in Georgia between now and then. You can vote if you're 18 in the special election, but you weren't 18 in the general election, or the runoff, I should say. And we're looking at 2 Senate runoffs in Georgia. So that really is a testament to the work that she and other grassroots organizers have done in that state, because that is just not something that I think even 2 years ago people would have expected.
Right. And another storyline, obviously, out of the election in terms of women is the record number of Republican women that won. And we've talked many times on our Women on Wednesdays. We've had a couple of panels on this topic, but about, after the midterms, when we saw 35 new Democratic women elected into Congress and only one Republican woman, and that really being a wake-up call in many ways to Republican women in order to go out and recruit and fund and support female candidates. And they did well position them to sort of take advantage of the swing that we saw toward the Republican Party down ballot. I know you have a big piece up on this right now. So give us your sense of what was behind that and a little bit about some of the work that the party did and what kind of carried these women over the line.
So there were records broken this year, both overall in terms of women in Congress and specifically by Republican women who gained ground as Democratic women lost ground in terms of representation in Congress. So, and these numbers will go up because we're still, frankly, waiting on quite a number of races where women are, positioned to win, Republican women.
Right.
So as of right now, 138 women are going to be in Congress overall next year, at least. That is breaking a record that was set in 2019 by the midterms you just talked about, which was 127.
Right.
Now that's mostly driven on the House side. So there's going to be 114 women minimum in the House next year, and that's up from 102. Now, Democrats really made up ground. As you said, they only elected one new woman in the midterms. There's going to be 34 women, Republican women, overall in Congress next year, and 26 of those are in the House. Now, their record previous to that in the House was 25, set back in 2006.
Right.
It had dwindled to 13 women last Congress. So they've already doubled their number of women in the House going into the next Congress. And that number is going to go up a little bit. I'm expecting a couple of races that are still yet to be called to go to the Republican women in those.
And they
races.
had two retirements, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the retirements, and this is a really good example of one of the races this year, was in the Indianapolis area. It's was represented by Susan Brooks, a Republican. She was also in charge of House recruitment for the party. She announced she was going to retire. Victoria Spartz was the Republican candidate in that district, and Christina Hale was the Democrat. Now, that district interests people for a lot of reasons. First of all, it was one of 27, or was it 47? I'll check that in a second, races where women were running against women. So we actually had two women competing in the same seat. And, Democrats, I think, really thought they would pick that seat up. As race ratings changed, it got more and more favorable to Democrats headed into the election. Susan Brooks is one of the women within the Republican Party who would kind of sounded the alarm and said, after the midterms, and said, if you don't start recruiting more women and supporting them to get them through Republican primaries, not only are we not going to have representation in Congress, we're not going to win seats in some of these suburban districts like this. And so Victoria Spartz won that race, and it was seen as a real kind of bellwether for how Democrats and Republicans were going to fare, frankly, with white suburban women in races across this country. And, Victoria Spartz prevailed in that race. So she'll be coming to Congress in January.
So, Emily, picking up on that too, with talking about, Democrats who actually had some notable freshman Democrats that lost, and also some notable losses within sort of high profile House races. Wendy Davis is coming to mind. And I know you know Texas politics better than anybody. But there was a lot of talk that maybe she was going to be able to beat Chip Roy in that district. And ultimately she wasn't able to do that. Is that area just too difficult for a Democrat, or what do you think about her political future? Because she's always talked about. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think she still has a bright political future, but I think in these races, in Texas, in races, congressional races where Democrats, women ran as sort of more moderate Democrats, they struggled. And there was, I think, look, in Texas, there was this suggestion that maybe Texas wasn't a conservative state, it was a non-voting state.
Yeah.
And the Republicans really refuted that message this time around because there was such extraordinary voter turnout. And there were just as many, if not more, Republicans coming out of the woodwork to vote. So I think you saw that in the suburban districts in Texas that really held, and that was the case for Wendy Davis and some others. But I think, look, the challenge with the polling was there's no substitute for the ground game. I mean, I remember a Senate race. So Amanda Becker was in, she was in Maine covering the Susan Collins race. And she was sort of calling back to the office basically and saying, look, I know what the polling shows, but you should see this ground game. Like, I don't know. I kind of think she's going to hang on. We were all saying, well, the gap is getting wider. And she was like, yeah, but the enthusiasm and what I'm seeing on the ground. And there just wasn't enough of that. I think at the end of the day, there's still this over-reliance on the polling. Even though it was so wrong in 2016, we fell into the trap of trusting it again in 2020 because we didn't have any other way to sort of gauge sweeping public opinion. And there was no substitute at the end of the day for the knocking on doors and the block walking. And that really ended up, I think, playing a big role.
Yeah, much difficult sort of trying to do that kind of campaigning in the middle of a pandemic. For sure.
The Republicans weren't that. I think we're less concerned about doing it. And I'm sure that played a role.
Yeah.
And the states where Democrats surprised and overperformed, Arizona and Georgia. And it's because there were ground games in those states, not coming from the top down, but coming from the bottom up, frankly, where ground games should come from. Yeah. And, sometimes a president's campaign helps out a little bit, but you really are relying on those activists and those advocates that are part of their communities and getting the vote out. Yeah. And I went to Arizona about 10 to 14 days before the election and came away after 5 days saying, I think Democrats are going to flip this state. Opposite reaction I had in Maine, because I was there. I saw the work they'd been doing. I talked to dozens and dozens and dozens of voters. And I saw something different happening on the ground than what I was seeing in other areas of the country.
Well, and that's what's so important about having journalists be able to, get out of our bubble here in Washington, right? and be on the ground talking to voters. You can learn so much more that way, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. One other, I hope I'm not revealing any of your sources, Becker. I'll be careful here. One of the other moments I remember for this campaign season is there were some Democratic operatives who were calling Amanda, who are in Florida. They were on the ground in Florida where there was some semblance, at least trying to have a ground game. Right. And they were talking to Amanda and they said basically like, look, we're asking to get reassigned. We think Florida is basically a lost cause and we're asking to get reassigned to Wisconsin and to Michigan. And in the moment, again, I thought that was, sounded nuts. Like, Florida is such a battleground state. Like, why? How could that be? But that turned out to be really prescient too, Amanda. I don't know if you even remember that conversation.
Oh, yeah, no, I was talking to one of those people just the other day.
Yeah.
And specifically, they were saying we don't see the kind of, first of all, on a state level, the Democratic Party there is less developed than it is in other areas of the country. It's less funded, less well-funded, less well-organized. And they were saying particularly they were seeing problems with Latino and Latina outreach in Florida from the Democrats. Mm-hmm. And they thought their time, because a lot of these people were specific to organizing Latino and Latinas, they were saying they thought their time would be best used somewhere else in the country where they could have more of an impact.
Turns out they were right.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I was talking to someone today too about the Donna Shalala race who lost, Democrat, against Maria Salazar in Florida, and apparently the Salazar campaign had her, was looking promising, had good numbers, and she was, I think, up 3 or 4 going into the election, and nobody, even on the Republican side, really believed it. So there were no sort of reinforcements that came in there for her. She managed to win despite that. But there was just this conventional wisdom that wasn't the case. And I think that, is sort of a misreading, again, of what happened in Florida, right?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, I think Florida and Texas, which we were just talking about, obviously were not good states for Democrats this year.
Right.
Texas, I think, was always a bit of a pipe dream. And Florida is a state that I think they've been reluctant as a party to realize just isn't firmly a swing state anymore. And it's moved into the red column more than the purple column.
Yeah.
And they have to make a decision. There's a lot of electoral votes there, obviously, but they have to make a decision on a national level about how many resources they want to devote to a state like that versus organizing the Georgias and the Arizonas and places that are trending more favorably to them. So
Texas has to be such a, a game changer place, right? I mean, it's like those 36 electoral votes looming out there, right?
Like it might just going forward be the Republicans' California, like things change.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to change with them if you want to be successful in electoral politics. And I think Donna Shalala, which, by the way, I checked, it is 47 House races where it was 2 women competing.
Yeah.
I don't think it says anything about her specifically that she lost. I think Florida was just not a good state for Democrats this year. Number two, I think a lot of these people who won their districts for the first time in 2018, a lot of them flipped from Republicans in 2018. That election was an election where Trump was not on the ballot, and it was a chance for people who really hated Donald Trump to reject everything that he stood for.
Yeah.
And so people went and they voted, that way. And that's what we saw happen in the midterms. It was a referendum on Trump's presidency. This year was different. He was back on the ballot. So, they could just vote against Trump if they wanted to reject Trump, and then still vote for their House and Senate candidates who they might like. And I think that's part of what you saw happen up in Maine. And when we talk about how flawed polling is, I hope that Maine is the very first place that they start to do a post-mortem of what happened with polling heading into this election.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even in Florida, where I think in that Maria Salazar, Donna Shalala race, she was able to really capitalize, and she was very vocal about sort of the democratic socialism component. And obviously that resonated, to Cuban Americans in Florida, and she was able to speak to that. But that sort of goes to my next question, which is that the divide that we're now seeing within the Democratic Party. And we seem to, over the last few days have two women sort of emerge on both sides of that. The Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, a more moderate, obvious district, doesn't think, that the, defund the police and, more of that more progressive talk. And then you've got the AOCs of the world, right, who are not going to be going along with that. And so there's now this division that managed to stay united, in order to defeat Trump, but that now you sort of see that both sides kind of going head to head in the media, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's particularly fascinating because if you look at, it would be very interesting to look at the political stances and where the women who were responsible for Biden's victory fall in that threshold. I was doing a little reading today. I mean, if you look at, the Black women in the South who are in many ways responsible, versus the white progressive women, I think many of whom are more moderate and, sort of, can't get their own house in order from the standpoint of determining who they're going to vote for. I don't know. I think this is an interesting divide, and this is something that's going to be facing. This is, the Democratic Party is going to have to grapple with this in a really big way.
And either way, you have women on both sides of that divide who are going to be determining the future of the Democratic Party. Yep. And I'll say a couple of things on this front. Yeah. For the Abigail Spanbergers of the world who are upset that was the message. First of all, that was not the national, defund the police was not the national message coming from Democrats. So I think that's a bit of a false place to start from, despite the fact that she was very angry about it on a call this week. Or was that last week? I can't even.
I think it was this week.
And, then you had the AOCs of the world pointing out that, on issues like Medicare for All, the Democrats who backed Medicare for All won this year, including some in many swing areas, swingy districts. And the reality is the Democratic Party is going to have to grapple with the fact that they didn't really have an economic message this year, big picture. If you looked at, again, the exit polling, which I will say is more accurate when it's looking at issues than candidates. 35% of the country, a plurality, more than any other issue, thought that the economy was their top issue that they were voting on. 82% of the voters who said that was their top issue voted for Donald Trump. That to me says that we were not getting a compelling economic message from the Democratic Party that was cohesive in any way. If you're a moderate Democrat and you don't want the progressive message to dominate, you better have your own message, because in a vacuum, it's going to be the progressive message that takes hold.
Yeah, I mean, it was, to get to your point too, a very divided electorate. I mean, there was one question on the exit polls just about the handling of the COVID situation in the U.S. And it asked voters, how well do you think the U.S. is dealing with the coronavirus? And the numbers, I don't know if they've changed over the last 24 hours, but at one point it was sort of 50-50. 50% of the electorate thought that we were doing a good job. It was going well, efforts to contain the virus. And the other half said it was going badly.
Yeah.
And I think there's a partisan element actually to how people think about that question, even when they're answering it. Because to some people for whom economy is the top issue, They're looking at the coronavirus and how it's being handled from an economic standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Where there are other voters who are answering that question about how it's being handled from a containing the virus standpoint.
Yeah.
So even on a question like that, I think polling is going to kind of be all over the place because we don't know for each of those voters what was in their head when they were thinking about how to answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Do either of you have, following certain congressional races with some of the new women entering Congress, what we know so far about the kind of women who will be in that freshman class, and any notable folks that you think are worth sort of paying attention to see what they do when they get here?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple on my list. There are a bunch of firsts, and I love that. It's my favorite category. So Yvette Harrell in New Mexico is the first Republican Native American woman to represent New Mexico. Maria Elvira Salazar, who we were talking about, who unseated Donna Shalala, is the second Cuban American woman ever elected to Congress. Cynthia Lummis in Wyoming is the first female senator to represent the state. So there's some cool, in the mix in all these things. Oh, also a record 3 Native American women are headed to Congress after 18 of them ran for Congress. And this is something that I think was interesting. Of those 18, half were Republicans and half were Democrats. So there's a lot of political diversity, ideological diversity among Native Americans as well. So I just thought there were some cool stats in there, some cool firsts in this list.
Yeah. What do you think, Amanda?
Same, and also the first Korean American women were elected. There's 2 right now, including, one of these new Republican women, and there might end up being 3 by the time all of this is over with. So Michelle Steele and Young Kim would both be Republicans from the Southern California area, kind of in Orange County, south of LA. So they would be 2 of 3 of the first Korean American women to serve in the U.S. Congress.
So I'm going to talk about the other woman's name who is very prominent and on all the ballots, right? And that's Kamala Harris. What are your thoughts on, the significance of the moment for her, what it means to women, and the kind of partner that she's going to be in the White House to President-elect Biden?
Amanda, you want to start?
Sure. I think that there's, I will say, I said the other day, the worst hot take I'd heard on this was a man, of course, who tweeted that this was really no big deal. There'd already been a woman on the tickets. Like, what does it matter that we have a woman VP? And it's just like, literally talk to any woman in your life. It's a big deal. And I don't know, it's hard to sort out what effect VP picks have on, how the race went and stuff like that. But I think this was a moment that women across the board really celebrated to a large extent. Whether you were a white woman or a Black woman or a South Asian woman, this is a first.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I totally agree with that. Again, regardless of your ideological affiliation, getting to watch this moment with, I've got a little girl, getting to watch that moment and knowing that she'll grow up never knowing any different than that a woman can be vice president. My God, let's hope president.
Yeah.
At some juncture. Nice, long overdue. I think that's a pretty magical, historical moment. I also am going to guess, again, I could be wrong on this, but I am going to guess that we have seen the end of 2-party white man tickets of the
Democratic Party.
Yeah, right. 2 white men on the ticket.
Yeah. And, I think also, she is going to, carve out her own way of doing things, but she's also going to be now very well positioned to, potentially run for president herself in, 2024, if Biden only serves 1 term, which I know he says he's not going to be doing, or, 2028, right?
Yeah. Has he officially said that he will definitely run for a 2nd term?
I think someone, his press secretary said that the other day I read.
Yeah.
I don't think it came from his mouth, but yeah.
The ultimate male ally thing to do would be to, run for 1 term and then really put your efforts behind her. Or as my mom said, the ultimate male ally thing would be for him to serve 3 years and then resign, right, and let her go in as an incumbent. But I think it's very unusual once people are president to see them not want that power for a second 4 years.
Yeah. What do we think about Dr. Jill Biden and sort of there's been a couple of different articles recently about, her going to, continue. She's obviously a professor, continue to teach, have her own sort of, paid career in addition to obviously the things that she wants to accomplish as first lady. And, as I mentioned earlier, it's like we're going to have the second man, right? And I said somewhere the other day that it's great to, finally have a man as a first of something instead of to constantly have women being the first. So what do we think about sort of her role? I know you guys have done a piece on this and, how it's going to be maybe a bit different than what we've seen in the past.
I think this is really appealing to women. I mean, I think that women across ideologies cheer for women when they're breaking both barriers and kind of stereotypes. And this is a more modern marriage that we're going to see in the White House, where for both of them, frankly, Jill Biden, Dr. Jill Biden is maintaining her own identity and her own career. Kamala Harris kept her last name, and he's going to take a leave of absence from his work. So, these are two kind of marriages that defy and partnerships that defy kind of how we have traditionally done things in this country. And I think a lot of women are looking forward to seeing that play out at our highest level of government.
I can't do anything better than that.
Yeah. I wanted to also get your thoughts on other women who made a big difference in this campaign behind the scenes. We mentioned Stacey Abrams a little earlier. Of course, Biden's campaign was run by a woman, Jenna Mellon Dillon. Either of you have, women that come to mind that, made a big difference sort of behind the scenes in this campaign?
Yeah, sure. Becker, you want to go first?
I would look to some of the real grassroots groups that not only turn out voters, but get women to run, like groups like Run for Something. These are groups that are there year after year, not just for, a presidential campaign, getting women in the pipeline, getting women voters excited about their local candidates, and then, turning them out when they're on the ballot. And so I had, a woman in Arizona who ran for and won Pima County Recorder. She's a Native American woman in Arizona, and she has, been working for years to increase voter participation on her reservation land, which she herself does not live on, but it's in the greater Tucson area, in between Tucson and Phoenix. And she decided after 2016, she started an indivisible group for her tribe specifically. And she, she increased participation over the past 4 years. And she is now Pima County Recorder, which actually has a pretty big role in terms of determining kind of rules for early voting and mail-in voting and stuff like that. So, she kind of turned her passion for increasing access and turning out voters to now taking on that role formally in local government. And you saw that play out in a lot of localities across the country. And I think these are really kind of the unsung heroes of this election.
And then there are some of the sort of sung heroes, right? Like there are people like, Elise Stefanik, who was very squarely in Trump's corner, with her e-PAC, the PAC that she established to help, conservative women run for office. Obviously, we already talked a little bit about Cindy McCain, but, Cindy McCain stepping out in a big way for Biden. And, many believe making a pretty big difference in Arizona. And then, obviously Biden's little sister and confidant and advisor, in many ways has been, I think, a big role for him, a big sort of backbone of that campaign. So, do
you think that she'll play a role in his administration as an advisor or anything formal?
It's interesting. I've been trying to look at all these short lists and sort of see where she ends up. I can't imagine that she won't in some capacity. Although I do think that, Democrats spent the last 4 years talking about sort of, an incestuous relationship in the White House and how inappropriate it was to have all of these members of the family as part of the administration. And so I think they'd have to be pretty cautious.
Yeah, for sure. But that's always, the most fun of after the election is kind of talking about who could possibly get different cabinet posts. What do you guys and Amanda, I mean, know a lot of these women too, and you as well, Emily. What do you think are some of the women to watch kind of on these short lists for some of the big cabinet positions? It's great that there are so many.
Well, I would love to. I mean, first of all, he's committed to having kind of 50% women and committing to also, socioeconomic and racial diversity.
Right.
So we will be tracking that to see if that plays out. I would love to see women get a role like they haven't had before, like Treasury Secretary.
Right.
I don't know if it'll be an Elizabeth Warren type person or if it'll be someone more moderate, but there are a lot of cabinet roles where women have never served. So I would like to see some ground broken there by the Biden administration.
Defense Secretary too, right?
Yeah, I mean, that could be Michelle Flournoy. It could be Tammy Duckworth, Susan Rice potentially for Secretary of State. I looked like, they were having conversations around potentially Meg Whitman for Commerce or Melody Hobson, who has been on the short list for like 3 different cabinet posts.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, again, they've sort of pledged and drawn a line in the sand and said that they would be devoted to equity in this process. So we're going to be really curious to see how that plays out.
So let's see. We have a bunch of questions. So let me see what we have here and see if we can take a few of those. Here's a Texas one for you, Emily. Touched on this a little bit, but Isabel asked, as a proud but discouraged Texas Democrat, can you talk about what you're seeing women can do to move the needle more in Texas or other historically Republican states toward swing state status? And what do you think that they can do in that respect?
Well, if you're asking as a Democrat, I will tell you Texas seems pretty firmly entrenched. I mean, I've lived here for 18 years, and every 2 years, basically, is the blue wave beginning, or is the state going to turn purple? We've seen in previous election cycles a sort of a deeper purpling in the suburbs and exurbs. Obviously the urban centers, save for Tarrant County, where Fort Worth is, all the other urban centers are really sort of pretty deeply Democratic already. But the power of the rural and exurban and suburban voter in Texas is still extraordinarily strong. So, I mean, I think the areas where you're seeing the biggest movement are in the suburbs, but I also think it is good news for Republicans that they saw pickups, like in the Rio Grande Valley, that they saw pickups among Latinos along the border, second, third, fourth generation immigrants. You can expect to see them continue to invest there, and I think Democrats have fallen down a little on their game among that community.
What do you attribute that to in the Rio Grande Valley turning more red?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, the sort of early indications are those folks really appreciate and appreciated Trump's sort of economic stance, his sort of entrepreneurial spirit, being a businessman. But I think the other thing that's really important to recognize is that immigration is a really complicated issue, particularly for immigrants, for third and fourth generation immigrants who felt like they waited in line, they waited for their turn, they came over, they bought property. It's a complicated dynamic, and I don't think that Democrats can take those voters for granted. I mean, the last addition to that is a lot of those folks along the border are pretty staunchly Catholic or evangelical. Yeah, and abortion is a really important issue for a lot of those women as well.
That's a good point. Let's see. Here's a good question from Caitlin. She says, you spoke about the potential splintering of the Democratic Party. How do you foresee Trump's reluctance to concede and the infiltration of QAnon affecting the future of the Republican Party and their chances for 2024? And I will say, I think 2 of the women that were elected to Congress from the Republican Party have sort of espoused the QAnon beliefs. Is that right?
It is. There are 2. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene and also Lauren Boebert in Colorado. And I will say that especially in Marjorie Taylor Greene's case, she did make efforts the closer the election got to distance herself from what she'd said about QAnon in the past, which was mainly retweeting and sharing conspiracy theories that are part of QAnon, and said that she had been a victim of disinformation and misinformation, like hundreds of thousands of people have been in this country.
Millions.
Millions at this point. I'm not quite sure. But, I could see that being a compelling reason or excuse with a lot of voters who might have fallen prey to the same sort of misinformation that we're all getting on the internet. In terms of, refusing to concede, I have to say I spent election day and I am still in a very conservative part of Ohio outside Cincinnati. Most of the Trump signs disappeared within a couple days after the election, which says to me that the average Trump voter believes this election is over. I'll be interested to see whether the president is able to fundraise for the legal challenges that are to come. This is not something you get public funding for to fight to keep the White House. You have to raise money for it. Is it going to get to a point where he has to spend his own money on it? Because I don't see the average Republican voter, or even frankly, most Republican voters, being super excited to drag this out more and donate money to a legal fund.
Right. And as we talked about earlier, too, we have these 2 Senate races in Georgia, which are going to, decide who controls the Senate. And so there'll be obviously a focus on that, which is also, I think, maybe why we've seen sort of Mitch McConnell saying the things that he's saying right now, right, in order to maybe try to keep that Trump base engaged as much as possible. What do you think about that, Emily or Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the case. I've been, it takes a lot now to surprise me, but I've been surprised at how much, how strongly these Republican elected officials have stuck in his corner, in Trump's corner, even when you have secretaries of state, conservative and Democrat around the country, basically saying, not just basically, publicly saying, there's absolutely no evidence of voter fraud. Our elections were secure. That dynamic has been really fascinating to watch. And it feels to me like a sort of endless fundraising initiative, and that Trump will not go quietly. He'll just sort of retreat to Florida and spend the next 4 years saying the election was stolen from him.
What do you think, Amanda?
We're on the same page on it.
Good thing we work together.
Trump is physically gone from the White House before January 20th. I think there's a decent chance he goes to Mar-a-Lago for the holidays and never comes back. He's never liked being in DC. Melania in particular has never liked being in DC. She wanted to stay in New York and did stay in New York for a while after he was first elected. So, I think we're going to hear grumblings from him. I think we're going to see him launching his new media endeavor kind of as a space for his people to convene. But I don't think that will remain the mainstream Republican position. The farther we get out from this election, I think that they're walking a careful line now, especially as you said in Mitch McConnell's case, because we do have these 2 Georgia runoffs that will probably determine which party, controls the Senate next year, whether it's him or Chuck Schumer.
Right.
And so until then, I would expect to see national Republicans be careful. But there's already diminishing returns for a lot of these Republicans to be repeating some of this election was stolen type, verbiage. And it's only going to become more the case, the farther we get out from last week.
Yeah. Someone said this morning, which I thought was a good term, was performance art, right?
Yeah. That's what Congress is to a large extent at the end of the day.
Yeah. Okay. Here's another question from Isabel. She said, if you had a crystal ball, which newly elected women beyond the obvious Kamala Harris do you expect you'll be reporting on a lot in the coming years?
Well, I know we just barely all survived this election. But if you want to look at 2024, I think Nikki Haley for sure is going to throw her hat into the ring for the Republican nomination. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more women, like maybe Kristi Noem from South Dakota.
Is Joni Ernst on your list?
Yeah, Joni Ernst. A lot of these, particularly women who are current or former governors, I would expect to see running for president. I would expect to see some of these Republican women in Senate continue to play high-profile roles, such as Joni Ernst. I think we'll see the Democratic women, especially in the Senate, and even those who didn't run for the presidential this year. I think Stacey Abrams is expected to make a gubernatorial run. So we'll be watching her. I will be looking to see what role Elizabeth Warren plays in this next administration, whether it's remaining in the Senate to kind of push policy from there and pressure Biden from that point, or whether she ends up a part of the administration herself. So those are kind of some of the biggest names I'll be watching over the next couple of years.
What do you think is going to happen with Nancy Pelosi as Speaker?
You know, she's challenged every time and she always pulls through. So if I was a betting person, which I'm not, I leave that to my brothers. They're more into it. I would, you know, I think Nancy Pelosi is one of the most skilled politicians in Washington. And if I had to bet in anything related to Nancy Pelosi, I would put my money on her coming through.
Mm-hmm.
What do either of you think is next for Ivanka Trump?
That's a good question. I don't think any of them, honestly, are going to be going away. I think they will be on sort of the public persona, whether that's a Trump media channel or something, right? And I would not be surprised if she tries to run for something eventually.
Yeah, Trump TV to me is the logical next step here. I think that's where they're all headed.
Let's see. Here's a question, Amanda, about policy. This is by Andra, and she says, what do you think the effect of increased female descriptive representation in Congress will be on the substantive outcomes for women in the next 4 years? Any legislative changes we can expect will obviously depend on Senate composition, but curious as to your thoughts nonetheless, she says.
I think one area in that we will really see the impact from women, and when we already have, is childcare and education, specifically in what we're expected to get now in terms of another coronavirus relief package. I think there's going to be a more fulsome effort to address the childcare crisis a more meaningful way. Even in the last proposal, which of course did not pass, it wasn't signed into law. They only gave enough assistance for, I think, what ended up being a few weeks worth of childcare once you kind of divvied it up across this country. So I think that there's going to, you know, women are really pushing the conversation on that, women from both parties, frankly, because I think that they see that is a winning bipartisan issue, because there are hundreds of millions of working women in this country who cannot perform their job right now because they're trying to deal with kids at home who are doing remote learning. And now even the schools that have reopened are shutting back down again. I mean, I don't know what ended up happening. Ohio's governor was doing a press conference as we started this, and the expectation in Ohio is that Ohio is going to start shutting back down again. So, and a lot of the individual school districts already have. So you had about 900,000 women leave the workforce in September, and a lot of that was due to childcare issues. And so I would expect that to be one policy area on which A, women will drive the conversation in Congress, and B, there will be bipartisan efforts to get something done.
And Emily, I assume you guys, this will be something certainly that you all will be covering, those trends of how COVID has impacted women so significantly, which it's just tip of the iceberg, what we know now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, one other aspect is like, what can Biden accomplish through executive order that he doesn't need Congress for? And I think there are a couple of angles around, you know, supports he can provide through Obamacare, or things he can do around Title X funding and, you know, funding that goes to reproductive health care. I think there's some aspects that he may be able to dive into. One other thing we didn't talk about actually was some outcomes in state legislatures. Actually, promising. You know, really interesting and in many ways backed by or pushed by women. You know, Colorado voters for the first time approved paid medical and family leave in the state, which is obviously a big deal, particularly during a pandemic. You know, voters in Portland, Oregon approved universal preschool, universal pre-K. And then there were obviously initiatives to, you know, further restrict abortion access. Some of them, they failed in Colorado, for example. They passed in Louisiana. So there was a lot on the ballot this time around at the state level that also affected women's lives.
Great. Let's see. Here's a Susan Collins question.
Perfect for Amanda.
Yeah. Pam is asking, how would you account for Collins' significant drop in votes from typically high 60s to 51%?
I don't think she dropped to 20 or 51%. Last I checked, she had won that race by 7 to 9 points, which is less.
Some of her support did erode a bit.
Yes, I mean, but she was reelected by astronomical margins in some of the prior races. So, a 9-point win is still a much bigger win than almost any other senator in a swing race this year can tout coming out of this. So I still consider that a very strong finish for Susan Collins, considering she was not ahead, I don't believe, in a single poll for about 6 months before the election. Not only was she behind Sarah Gideon, she was behind anywhere from 4 to 5 points to, in one, well into the double digits. So, she really did better than everyone expected to a very large degree. And, she was in the race of her career and she pulled it off.
Now that this election is behind her, how do you think that having that, pressure off of her, how do you think that will impact her sort of in this new, regardless of who actually controls the Senate, it's going to be super close, we know, right? And so what can we expect from Susan Collins? Obviously, she made some pretty significant votes in this last year, but what can we expect from her in the next 4 years?
Here's the thing about Susan Collins. She is remarkably consistent. So if you look at what she's done before, you have a very good idea of what she's going to do next. She is going to approve the bulk of Biden's cabinet picks.
Right.
She is going to vote for the bulk of his judicial picks. She does this for Democrats. She does this for Republicans. So when she did it for Trump, it made a lot of Democrats angry because they see her as a moderate. When really what I think Susan Collins is more of an institutionalist and a traditionalist, more than an ideological moderate. And it's that kind of independence that allows her to, support the picks of both parties. She comes from a position that a president deserves to have their cabinet. A president deserves to appoint judges. That's their role. And her role is to simply assess whether that person is qualified to serve or not. So I think you will see her continuing to be a swing vote in the Senate, which is going to be very closely divided. Republicans are expected to probably control it, but even if they do, she will be that kind of swing vote. Either way, she has a long history and friendship with Joe Biden. So, at one point they gave floor speeches about one another when they were both in the Senate that were just glowing, just going on and on about how wonderful the other person was. So I think that she's someone he can work with. I think she will be one of his first calls on the other side of the aisle. We will expect to see a lot more of what Susan Collins has done before going forward. Yeah.
Anything you want to add to that, Emily?
No. I mean, hopefully anybody knows the insights of Susan Collins as well as Amanda.
Okay, here's a question from Shaylin. She says, you mentioned education with Jill Biden being a teacher. Can we anticipate her playing any role in schools post-COVID and during COVID?
Oh, man, I think so. I mean, I think that's going to be, first ladies always find the place where they step out in their sort of particular areas. And I think, not only is she perfectly suited for that arena and has sort of deep personal and professional insights, this is also a moment in history where education is totally fractured and the disparities, facing low-income kids and underserved communities are growing wider by the moment, between the technology gap and between some kids going back to schools and some not. I think absolutely we could expect to see that as a primary focus for her.
One other legislative question here. This is from Kennedy. And she says, with the rising number of women in the legislature, do you think paid leave legislation will be passed soon? I think, Amanda, maybe you touched on a bit of that before, but do you have anything else on that?
Biden made this paid leave not just for childcare, but as part of his caregiver agenda that would include kind of people in that sandwich generation that are also dealing with elderly parents. He made that a huge priority during the campaign. It was something really designed to reach out to women and to speak to women. Whether he can get that passed, of course, will depend on Congress. So we're just going to have to see, going back to people like Susan Collins just for a second, not to always make it about Susan Collins, but she's coming from a state where she won by the same margin that Biden did from the opposite party. So, a lawmaker like that might think to themselves, I do have a mandate from my voters, and my voters clearly chose me while they were choosing the policies on a national level of the other person. And I have a duty to consider those policies and, you know, whether they might work for my state. So maybe we can see some movement on that. You know, I'm not going to predict the end of partisan gridlock in Washington or anything like that. And so, you know, with Republicans probably still controlling the Senate. Now, if Democrats somehow pull it off in Georgia and take control of the Senate, yeah, I mean, we'll see paid leave and a lot of other things, but I'm assuming that it's still going to be closely divided in favor of Republicans.
We have a couple questions about Amy Coney Barrett. And I guess, you know, I know you don't want to give personal opinions, obviously, on this because you're a journalist, but Vanessa was asking if do you feel if the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett is a step in the right direction for equality for women or a step in the wrong direction? And I guess maybe I would just put that to you all as just your thoughts in general on, you know, that process, how it played out, and what maybe you expect to see from her on the court.
Yeah, I mean, I think it totally depends on what side of the aisle you're on, right? I mean, I think for Republican women, a lot of Republican women have been waiting a very long time for someone like Amy Coney Barrett on the court. And for them, this was seismic. This was exceedingly historic. And I think you also, you know, by the way, there's no doubting the fact that having a working mom of seven kids, send to the high court, someone of her age, you know, I mean, that's pretty extraordinary from the standpoint of, you know, if we're promoting Jill Biden for keeping her teaching job in the White House, it's pretty extraordinary to have someone like this serving on the Supreme Court. Certainly historic and newsworthy. I mean, I think for a lot of Republicans and particularly pro-life Republicans, like this has been a long time coming and they are thrilled. I think obviously on the other side of the aisle, you have Democrats and in particular Democratic women who feel really frightened by this development, really frightened by this court and what it could mean for abortion rights, what it could mean for transgender rights. You know, so I think, again, this totally depends on your prerogative and what you're bringing to the table here. It's her ascension to the court is an extraordinarily big deal, regardless of what side of these issues you're on.
Right. All right. Well, I think we're out of time, but I wanted to thank you both so much for sharing all of your reporting. I encourage everybody to log on to the 19th. It's constantly filled with terrific reporting on so many important topics. And we just want to thank you both for being here with us. And hopefully maybe you guys can come back in a few months and give us an update on things. And thanks for spending a little bit of your evening with us. And thanks to everybody for attending. And this is our last, by the way, Women on Wednesdays for the semester. So we will be back with some different programming in January when school resumes. So if you have ideas or there's particular things you would like to see us talk about, please feel free to send us a message, and we hope to see you all soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.